If anyone listening lives in Toronto, you most likely know that our subway is a hotspot for very colorful characters. I was never an avid commuter until I got into college, but it didn't take long for me to realize that loonies loved to ride the train. It was about 11 p.m., and I was heading back from hanging out with some of my college friends. Now, I don't live in Toronto. My school is there. I live in Mississauga. For those that don't know, and most of you probably won't, it takes about half an hour for me to get to the bus terminal that has a bus going to my area, so I spent quite a lot of time sitting on the train. It was a weekday, so there weren't that many people still around, which was good because I preferred it not being packed. But unfortunately, this was the prime time for the colorful characters I mentioned earlier. When the train came, I found myself a comfortable spot. There was only about 5 other people in the cabin, or whatever one segment of a train is called. Everyone seemed fine, except for this tall white lanky dude who was standing right up against the doors muttering to himself. He had messy brown hair, his teeth were disgusting, and his eyes were bloodshot. It doesn't take a genius to figure out he was probably a bit less sane than the others. At first I just decided to mind my own business, plugging in both my earbuds and averting my gaze. But then from the corner of my eye, I noticed he was staring at me. Needless to say, I got a bit nervous. I continued to ignore him, hoping he'd leave soon or look at someone else, so I decided to look around the cabin, only to notice that everyone else had already gotten off, and it was just me and him. It was still quite a ways to go from my stop, so I decided to just let it be for now. I've seen people like him before, and usually they just mutter incoherent babble to themselves and not bother anyone. But this guy was unique. My music was still playing, and I wasn't looking at him, but then he moved and sat right in front of me. His grin exposing his rotten teeth, and his gaze bewildered as he stared at me, and this was right after a stop. I tried to ignore him further, but it was impossible because he was so close to me. I then noticed he began to say something. I couldn't hear and I didn't really want to, but he kept saying it and started to look agitated, so I took out my earbuds.
"Did you do it?"
he said with a raspy voice. I had no clue what he was talking about, so I just remained silent, the ride feeling like forever now.
"Did you do it?"
he started to shout. Then he stood up, looking very angry. Now, if this was a normal person, I'd have told them to fuck off by now. But this guy was on something, maybe meth. And if there's anything you should know about meth users, it's that fighting them or pissing them off too much is a grave mistake. They can't feel shit. Anyways, the train finally stopped and I got off quickly, still about 8 stops away from my destination. And he simply stared at me as the train rode away, with his haunting and bewildered gaze. Still no clue what he was on about asking me if I did it. But to be honest, I'd rather not know. I worked in law enforcement for 2.5 years, and had a good time in the city limits. But I grew up in the country, and I recently took a job with my state park instead. I always felt like the help was more appreciated in this field of work, and I liked the scenery and atmosphere of the environment. Big trees, a lot of wildlife, and cooler weather. On September 2nd, a team and I were sent out on a search op for a young girl, about 17, and her brother about 7, that went for a hike on a trail. Several hours later, the parents decided to call and file an MPR, missing persons report. They described the 2 children with great detail, like any good parent would, and within a few hours we left to start the search. It's pretty rare that a night op is put into place. We usually wait until morning to start a search. But when the parents are at your door begging for help, it makes it a little hard to sleep. On the search, there was me, Russ, Diz, and Mark. We're all experienced in the line of duty, because all 4 of us are ex-law enforcement and know how to handle our own. So we've always felt comfortable as a team. But what happened in this op is still affecting some of us in different ways. We set out on the trail that the 2 kids were said to be on. With very bright flashlights, we scanned the floor for any prints that might have gone off the trail, or inconsistencies like a limp or dragging. maybe bushes that have been stepped through or have broken limbs. We do this in case someone was attacked or dragged off. Unfortunately, kidnappings and rape cases do happen in this area. We've even stopped a few, but we can't be everywhere at once. There are hundreds of miles of park property. We just don't have the manpower. Anyway, Russ noticed the smaller of the two tracks starting to stop, and the shoe prints seemed to point in the opposite direction, before turning around and continuing the trail. We all agreed that this is what happened, so that we were all on the same page. But what we saw next was possibly the worst track to find when searching for someone. Blood. Blood in small amounts on the trail, and then on the bush just off to the right. The prints on the ground became those of a struggle, scuffs in the dirt and drag marks, like there was a wrestling match in the middle of the trail. Russ and I were in the front of our group, while Diz and Mark brought up the rear. And just like a wave hit all of us at once, we stopped. There they were, both of them still alive. We told them who we were, and that we were there to take them back home to safety, but the younger of the two would not open his eyes. He kept saying, "There's a yelling man here, and he wanted to hurt me." The older sibling sobbed as her arm and neck bled. Russ started to treat her wounds right as he saw them, and we asked her what had happened. She said we were walking up the trail, and I had turned around to see why my brother was lagging so much. But when I did, he was looking back at a man. The man looked at me and started to scream. He screamed like a mountain lion would. Then he ran at me and tackled me to the ground and started biting me. "Please just take us home." And of course, right as she raised her voice, crying and begging for us to get them home, we heard it. It sounded just like an elk call, but deeper and more raspy. We could hear rocks tumbling and bushes moving, as whatever this thing was moved through the trees. Diz and I pulled our service weapons and ordered Mark and Russ to pick the kids up. It is time to move. Normally we don't just jump straight to use of force, but this subject was showing he was willing to induce harm, and we agreed it was the best option. We quickly walked for at least 20 minutes back to the vehicles. It was a first for us, a situation like this, where supposedly a man was going around biting kids. Mark ran to the SUV and got both kids in, and I turned to face the tree line. I shined my light, and there he is, just standing there. He was looking straight at the vehicle the girl was in. I ordered him to put his hands up and lay down on the ground. Even though he was at least 30 to 40 feet away from me, I was not about to take a chance with this guy after what he did to these kids. He gave a half grunt and retreated back into the trees. Here is the part where judgment might be thrown at me, but I did not pursue him. We needed to get these kids back to their parents. So when he turned around and started to run, I shot. Not at him, but at the ground. He stopped and turned toward me again, but he just started to heave, like he was gagging, but only one long gag. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. We still have people on the lookout for him, but I haven't heard a thing. Until tonight, I've only had a few events that I would qualify as paranormal. I've been home all day, alone with my dog, watching football. I live with my parents, but they've been gone, working on a house all day that they recently bought. 2 hours ago, I left my house to go wash my truck at the nearest car wash. One clean truck later, I returned home, let my dog out, let him back in shortly after, and gave him a treat. The dog runs off and I began washing dishes. The only dog we have now is a year-old Boston Terrier. Our boxer recently passed, leaving us with only the one. Being a young dog, he has a lot of energy and very often goes to the bonus room, right above the kitchen, to run figure eights around the couches until he's tired. So there I stood washing the dishes, and I hear him start his circuit running upstairs. He was hauling ass, and it went on for about 5 minutes, before he instantly stopped. As I mentioned before, I was in the kitchen, and my parents' bed is visible from the sink where I stood. Right as he stopped running, I just happened to look into their room, and what do I see? My only dog on the bed, asleep. I instantly froze. It felt like the gears in my brain were screeching to a halt as I stood trying to figure out what I had just heard, or how he got down there so fast without me noticing. After standing at the sink confused for longer than I would like to admit, I finished the dishes and go to the laundry room to tend to my clothes. The laundry room is between my parents' bedroom and the stairs going to the bonus room. I stood folding clothes when I see my dog, now awake, walk slowly by the door towards the stairs, with his head inches from the ground. Again I froze, hoping that what was about to happen wasn't going to, but it did. I hear it. My dog begins growling quietly and deeply. I peep my head out of the laundry room, and he is at the foot of the stairs staring towards the top, steadily growling, the hair on his neck straight up. I call him and have him follow me back to the living room to sit on the couch. As I'm sitting there trying to play it cool, my mind's running 99 miles per hour. I look out the living room window across the back porch to my bedroom window and see something flash across. I thought, that's enough. Someone or something is in my house. So I jumped up and ran to my bedroom. And nothing. No one's in there. I'm freaking out, so I'm grabbing the dog and leaving until my parents get home, and we can clear the house together. I sit down on the edge of my bed to put my shoes on, and I hear something slam against the wood floor on the other side of the house, and I almost jumped out of my skin. I sprinted to the living room, got my dog, and ran out the front door to my truck. I drove to the nearest gas station where I called my parents. When my parents met me and we went back to the house, the loud noise I heard was the lid to a wooden medicine box that sits on our counter. It isn't hinged and it doesn't lock, but it is a tongue and groove style lid, meaning it couldn't have hit the floor without pulling the medicine box down with it, unless it was picked up and dropped. I don't know if this was paranormal or someone was in my house, but either way it creeped me the hell out. In 2004, I was 15 years old, living in central Minnesota. I had hunted on my grandparents' property east of Sandstone since I was 12, and had been fairly successful each year. That season was the same as most, going hunting with my dad and older brother for opening weekend, and then trying to get out hunting whenever I could after that. I think it was around the second weekend when I had one of the scariest hunting experiences of my life. On this particular day, after an unsuccessful morning hunt, my brother and I were walking back to the main house through the woods, and decided to walk on the street, instead of trudging through a snowy field. Parked on our property about 40 yards off the road was a white pickup truck that we didn't recognize. We approached cautiously, but the truck was abandoned, and there were tracks leading off into the woods in several directions. In the front on the dash was a pile of mail addressed to someone with the last name of Gamble, a name not associated with any of my family or nearby neighbors. My brother and I decided to just head back home and let our dad know about it since there was little else we could do. When we said the name we had seen in the window on the mail, my grandma immediately recognized it. She said, "Oh, that's a lady who lives a few miles away from here." My dad jumped on the four-wheeler to go see if the truck was stuck or broken down and offer help, but when he got down there it was gone. Without any cause for alarm, we all basically forgot about it as we had a warm lunch. After a post-lunch nap, we all mapped out our hunting strategies for that afternoon and headed out to hit the stands until dark. I was sitting in my stand, lost in thought, but constantly gazing around and trying to spot movement or flashes of brown and white. I was deep in thick brush on the edge of a swamp that borders a hardwood stand of trees. It was a favorite spot for afternoon hunts to get the deer as they migrate towards the field. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of brown to my right. I strained to identify exactly where I had seen it before I saw it again, as it slipped behind a pile of brush. I figured it to be about 50 yards away and moving towards me. I lifted my .30-30 Westernfield lever action to my waist and silently slipped the safety to the off position. For several long minutes, I saw and heard nothing. I began to question if I had seen anything at all, or if my imagination was finally taking over after being fooled by squirrels for several hours, when suddenly I heard a low noise from the thick brush. It sounded like a low growling, and my first thought was that a wounded deer was going through its dying moments from the neighbor's property to the east. But then it turned into a distinct growl and snarl. My mind immediately went from looking for a wounded deer to looking for a bear. It wasn't uncommon to see bears in the area, but the thought of one being that close was both exciting and nerve-wracking to 15-year-old me. The growls grew louder, and I saw the brush move slightly as the unseen bear moved closer to my stand. I placed the safety back on my weapon, but kept it at my waist. The growling stopped, and then it turned into a snarl and screaming sound that caused my heart to immediately drop in my chest in pure fear. I had never heard a bear make that sound, and suddenly I knew it was a wildcat of some sort. The brush moved, and I finally saw the animal for the first time. I had gone from expecting a deer, to a bear, to a wildcat of some kind. And while I wasn't wrong, I did not expect in the least what I saw in front of me. 35 yards away, in the woods of Minnesota on a November day, was a Bengal tiger that had to be at least 8 feet long, orange with black stripes. A Bengal tiger. I had seen them in books and at the zoo, but I had no frame of reference for what I was witnessing. I immediately had the gun to my shoulder, safety off and hammer cocked. My hands shook, and I thought I was going to throw up. While it was likely less than 30 seconds, I felt like I stared in shock at the tiger for at least an hour before it screamed once more, and then bounded into the woods to the north. I stood in my stand for several minutes, as the adrenaline wore off, and the reality of what had just happened washed over me. I asked myself over and over if what I had just seen was real. I didn't have a cell phone, so contacting my brother or dad was impossible to do. But I knew one thing. I did not want to be in the woods in the dark with it. I was also less than eager to immediately get down and walk back to the house with it nearby. So I just sat in the stand, in the ready position, looking for any signs of the tiger. When I didn't see anything, I got out of my stand and started the longest walk back to the house. I walked the entire quarter mile through the woods with the gun up in the ready position. Every twig snapping made me feel like a tiger was leaping towards me in the growing darkness. Needless to say, my family was skeptical when I rushed in to tell the story. They believed I had seen something, but the tiger part was hard to swallow. They figured it was likely a wildcat or a mountain lion at most, but I insisted that I had seen what I had seen. Regardless, we began to get ready for Wednesday night church, and the conversation continued until we got there. Immediately upon walking up to my cousin Scott, who owned and hunted the land adjacent to my grandparents, my dad makes a joke that they had to hear this ridiculous story that I made up. I was barely into the story when my cousin exclaimed, "Oh, you saw the tiger too?" My dad was floored, and I was vindicated. Slowly, the story began unfolding with answers. The white truck belonging to the Gambles was the connection piece. Mrs. Gamble lived several miles from our property and owned a large wild cat sanctuary. While the cats were all in cages and tagged with GPS monitors, apparently one had escaped, and a few neighbors reported seeing the truck wandering around our area. By the following day, we had heard from those who knew the Gambles that the cat had been returned, but there was never any official word that it had gotten loose. After that, everything went back to normal, and I had a killer story to share that no one believed. A year later, however, my grandma told us the news that Mrs. Gamble had been killed by that very tiger. She was alone in the cage with it, and it attacked her and mauled her to death. And now I have a bit more respect for the long, dark walk out to the deer stand. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story, or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. Be good to animals, even people. Shit. Are you tired of going to the doctor because you think something's really wrong with you, and it turns out you're fine?
Yeah!
Are you a hypochondriac that just needs some reassurance every now and then?
Yeah!
Well, we have the product for you. Introducing Dr. Ass from Ripco.
Ripco.
Dr. Ass is a revolutionary app for your smartphone. It can electronically smell and diagnose a blast from your ass. Here's just some of our satisfied customers in action.
Let me see here.
You've got a broken leg.
Ah! Ah!
You've got mail. Oops, I mean you've got tuberculosis.
Oh my gosh!
Hey Grandma, fart into this phone. Just do it, it's not that big of a deal. Well, okay.
You're healthy but old as fuck.
Oh my god. You're 80? It smells like you're 800. Okay, now let's do Ripley real quick. Squeeze out a fart, Mrs.
Either you're a dog or you need to go to the hospital immediately.
Alright, now it's my turn.
You just shit your pants.
He's right. Thanks, Doc. You can find Dr. Ass in the App Store and own it for only $6.99. So what are you waiting for? Start farting on your phone today. Once again, that's Dr. Ass from Ripco.
Ripco. Gel, snämar, bärksbus, hrish.
You've been eating guacamole. You've been eating beef stroganoff. Sniff sniff. Yummy. You died yesterday. You've been eating biscuits and gravy. You have mad cow disease.